Hey folks, Triple Crown here, coming to you from Vancouver, British Columbia. This is a round 8 summary of the Global War 1939 series playtest. Here we go for round 8. Sometimes the lesson of this round is, well, maybe you're in a fight sometimes in your life. Maybe you want to quit. Maybe you want to give up. Maybe you think it's over. But sometimes you need to persevere. You need to push through. You need to fight on, because sometimes there is still a chance. So we will get into what happened. Now, currently, the Axis need one more victory city, and it's going to come down to maybe Paris or maybe Stalingrad. So currently, this is the combined Allied forces that are in Paris. There is 39 units there, and France has 11 IPP to spend next round. Now these are the German units that are in Reims. Now there is a backup force behind them. However, they're only able to bring 32 units to the fight, including aircraft. So a little bit short. The Axis, however, they are building some heavy hitters, some Tiger tanks, some Mark 5s, some Mark 4s, and it is not over yet. However, both sides need to be committed to spending lots of cash, lots of money to win the battle of attrition. Now, the Allied force is split, so they're in more of a defensive posture. They just want to hold Paris, where the Axis want to build offensive units because they want to recapture Paris. So we will see what happens. Now, initially when I thought about this sounds like a fairly easy task for the Germans and the Italians. However, the British and the Americans, they're committed. So we'll get over to what I guess the Americans next turn is a small build. Currently in Western Europe, they've got only 3 armor and 4 infantry. The British, however, do have, I think it's about 12 units there that are able to enter Paris next turn, and the British are able to bring 12 the following turn, and the Americans are able to bring 24. So that is pretty large, pretty significant for the Americans. So looks like as of now, they have a slight advantage on the attrition. The Italians, despite all this, they're in control of Marseille. They have some territories in Russia, and I think they're up to 30 IPP. Never mind, after losing all this crap in Africa and getting convoyed here for 3, and losing Sicily and losing Sardinia. They do have Yugoslavia and Greece, and so they're still doing healthy. The bad news also for the Germans was, because there was, I believe, 3, I'm going to zoom in here. There was 3 infantry in a fortification in Stalingrad, and their fast movers, which was 5 armor and 1 Mark 4 or Panzer IV, were able to blitz through and take it, and that was with support of their aircraft, and they took it easily. However, the British had a counterattack. The Germans felt they needed to act this turn, because if the British got in with all of this stuff, that would have been a tough nut to crack with the fortification, so they got rid of it. However, the British also, with their, the Germans came in first into Kharkov with their 3 heavy artillery, and the British were in Cairo. Back down here, I'll back up. They had 3 naval transports that loaded up 3 armor and 3 infantry and went 1, 2, 3 into this sea zone here, and you can see they can unload. So they unloaded, and they also had a tank that blitzed through here and an infantry. So that was and the British actually weren't 100% committed to that maneuver, but when they saw it, it was there, and they seized that opportunity. So we'll say this guy is there. So it looks like, at least for now, Stalingrad is in firm British hands. Now, the Germans still have their 3 minor factories over here in the Axis Miners, and also the Colonial factory in Helsinki. So they can still produce 9 units here, plus the bonus units the Axis Miners get to produce, and another 2 units up here. So the Germans are just going to have to probably spend on the Western Front and the Eastern Front. And the Russians, even though they were out, they received 20 IPP from the Americans last turn, and they did a small build over here in Novosibirsk. And the Japanese did go into Mongolia. So the 2 cavalry that were here and the infantry are now Russian. So they are now part of the Russian forces, and the Americans were able to lend-lease the Russians only half of the 20 IPP, so 10. And so Russia had, I think, 17 from their remaining territories that have not been captured by the Axis. So they have 27 IPP to spend next turn at this major factory in Novosibirsk. So that is not too shabby for the Russians. However, the Japanese hoard, as you can see here, the horde sitting in the CCP territory is coming, and it's coming fast, and there's another horde right behind it. The KMT or the CCP were wiped out. They decided to make a stand. They killed about 8 or 9 Japanese ground units, but it didn't matter. The KMT decided it was best to back up. So they might make a final last stand in the northeastern KMT territory, or they could come down here to Xinjiang, undecided, or maybe they're going to counterattack. We'll see. There's still about 20 units there. In the Middle East, the British did not build, or they built mostly infantry this turn, and another couple transports here to possibly, swing around the horn into, or just basically they want to keep the Japanese away. So the Japanese now are aware of this, so they're staying away from the coast, and they can still make it back to Calcutta if they need, or, but I think that is their primary objective. So even though, the Japanese, the Russians just have a little bit of time left to be a nuisance, and so the Americans, who have been primarily spending in the Atlantic, were actually quite clever last round, working with the Australians and the New Zealanders. And what did they do? Well, if you recall, they had their fleet down here in the Carolines. Actually, they nuked these factories. So when we nuke a factory, we just go like this, or scorched earth. So they wanted to get rid of that factory, or those air and naval bases there. So that was the primary purpose, but also to put pressure on the Japanese from leaving the Money Islands alone from the Australians. And if you recall, the Australians were here. So the only place this small little fleet could go that was safe was over here. And they actually had left out a couple destroyers as a blocker, and it was taken out by these 2 medium bombers and a submarine that came in, and they did not sustain a casualty. So this fleet now is smaller, and so it's going to have to probably retreat back up here. And the Japanese also were forced to, they did take the Philippines finally. Philippines just lasted till turn 7. It forced the Japanese to come down here. Yes, they took the Philippines, but the coastal gun actually fired, and I think it sank 2 ships. So that was beneficial. And the Japanese, instead of building fast-moving ground units, they were forced to build a couple destroyers, 3 destroyers at this factory, and also build an air base for the scramble, because the Americans were sitting in the Carolines, and the Japanese wanted to have naval superiority. So they forced the Japanese to build navy, and also maybe get a little bit out of position to not use their aircraft to keep heading west to annoy the KMT and soon to be the Russians. So it did serve its purpose. However, once it served its purpose, it's going to go back to Hawaii and maybe rearm, maybe spend a little bit on Navy each turn. Now, some people wonder, you know, the Americans need to spend everything in the Atlantic. Maybe they need to spend in the Pacific. But it just seems like if you spend sometimes a little bit over here, or sometimes it can just be something simple like a destroyer or moving your Navy in one position where now you're projecting a little bit of power, it forces your enemy to react in a way that maybe they don't want to react. You're forcing them to maybe buy something that they don't want to buy. So it's kind of like you squeeze the balloon over here and now there's a problem over here. So sometimes the right answer is yes. The Americans and the Allies and the European theater are winning the war of attrition in terms of numbers. So that gave them the luxury of spending a little bit over here in the Pacific. Now, it would have been a mistake, for example, if the Germans, in regards to Paris, had naval superiority. So, but just a couple of housekeeping things that I forgot to mention. And I meant to mention this earlier. And I mentioned that the British had built a minor industrial complex in Upper Egypt. And just to point out, it was actually in Alexandria, because that territory is route 2. So that's original British territory, so they can build a miner there. So that is how the British are able to get that second industrial complex in the Northern Africa territory. And I think that is it. So I was gonna call it quits after the last round, but I think I'm now curious, you know, if this was to go 15 rounds, I still give it to the Axis. However, this is now a closer battle than I had anticipated. So I'm going to keep it going for another couple rounds. So thanks for watching, folks, and stay tuned for round 9 coming up next.